I just finished our second community conversations with the Y, featuring Seattle's son, Bruce Harrell. What an amazing conversation. What a history lesson to hear about his upbringing in the CD, his parents who were courageous in their own right in bringing together the Black community as well as the Asian community, his dad being African-American, his mom being Japanese American, and how love triumphed for the two of them, and how that spoke into his life, the importance of hearts and love leading the way and healing the divide in our community. So powerful. The good news is, with leaders like Bruce, we know there's a way for us to heal the divine, and there's a way for us to define a better path forward for all of us to create the future we want. I'm so glad we had this conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Conversations with the Y. He was first elected to the City Council in 2007 and was reelected in 2011 and 2015. In 2016, Bruce was chosen as president of the City Council. And for a brief period in 2017, Bruce served as acting mayor of the city of Seattle. On March 16th of this year, Bruce announced his candidacy for mayor of Seattle. And he has been a vocal advocate standing against anti-Asian hate. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Harrell to Community Conversations with the Y. So Bruce, welcome.
Thank you, Lori, for that warm introduction. I deeply appreciate it. The Y, as I assumed, did their research. And so thank you very much for that warm introduction.
Yes, we know all about you, Bruce, and we're so pleased to have you with us today. So to kick things off, please tell us about your upbringing in the Central District.
Well, one thing that wasn't mentioned is my relationship with the Y, and I want to take a few moments to say that I literally grew up on 24th and Olive across the street from the Y. And I would attribute some of my athletic ability from living across the street. And I had mentors and coaches, clubs that I belonged to. I learned how to do archery and play basketball and all kinds of things at the Y. Most importantly, I learned camaraderie. We also did camping, and we went downtown at the downtown branch to learn how to swim. I'm not really sure why we didn't use the pool that was built when the Y was reconstructed on East Madison or Meredith Matthews. I think it was because the lessons were more organized, but the Y has a very warm part in my heart. In the Central District, that was a time where, while we still had what they call income inequality now, we had different socioeconomic levels. My parents were just working class folks, as you described, an African-American father who was actually a construction lineman and apprentice lineman who moved into management at a time where African-Americans were getting new opportunities in management. And my mother actually worked for the Fax newspaper, and both did not have the opportunity to attend college. And so they sort of drilled in me the need to go to college and further one's education. But in our neighborhood, we had a retired vet, a military veteran. We had teachers, we had janitors, we had people that were of more limited means, but they all could live in the same neighborhood. And I think one of the tragedies we talk about now, particularly in political circles, is the income inequality and the sort of new creation of a subclass of both wealth and poverty. And one thing that dominates Seattle that we did not have then growing up was, a person that's worth 186 billion on one end of the spectrum, like a Jeff Bezos, and a subclass of poor people where they might have been somewhat disadvantaged, but now they're housing insecure or homeless. And that could be a teacher, it could be a mail carrier, it could be a food service worker. So this concerns me, and I know it concerns the mission of the Y to make sure that people have a pathway to success and opportunity, and that we find people's gifts while they are young to nurture those gifts such that they can be self-sustaining. But I have very fond memories of growing up in the Central District, very fond, and there were challenges too. Some of the issues that we deal with the police department now. People think, well, you've made it. You and your wife and your family are successful. They have no idea that even some of the police shootings and the police brutality, they weren't millions of miles away. They were in our neighborhood. I remember walking to a person who was killed by the name of Larry Ward, literally going to where he was shot and looking at the bullet holes. And so as we talk about API Heritage Month, one of the things I will talk about is with the anti-Asian violence that we're seeing. I'll take a walk through history because it's deja vu all over again, that we could see periods in our local history and our national history where we've seen these outbreaks of violence and hate. And I think it's good for our young generation to know that while tragic, yes, while unconscionable, yes, new, no. And so we could talk a little bit about that as this discussion unfolds.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Bruce. And glad to know you were a Y kid and you still have the Y close to your heart.
Certainly.
Few people in Seattle today know that the CD was a largely Japanese neighborhood before internment. Few people know that the CD became a Black neighborhood as a direct result of the forced removal of Japanese people, including American citizens of Japanese ancestry, from their homes and businesses there. Could you still feel the echoes of that 15 years later when you were growing up there? Could you just say more about that experience?
Sure. So what I find really interesting now, Loria, is that this could be a great opportunity for all of us to sort of better understand our culture. For many Japanese Americans, when you mention the Executive Order 9066, it resonates, and not in a positive way. That was the executive order that President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued in 1942 that required the authorized evacuation and in turn incarceration or imprisonment of Japanese Americans. And that was over 122,000 people forcibly removed from their homes, most of whom, a majority of whom I should say, over 70,000 were actually American citizens, including my mother. And so they were citizens as much as a citizen could be a citizen today, and they were, again, removed. And so what you saw, even going back toward that issue, as you go back in our history, you'll see other Asian groups that had been systemically or legislatively excluded as well. Going back to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which, as you may recall, after the gold rush, when a lot of Chinese had moved here as immigrant workers, that our United States government in 1882 prohibited more Chinese from coming. And not only was that wasn't just a one-time legislative act, it was renewed in 1892 and in 1902. Mm-hmm. So in the Central District, you still had remnants of the influx of a lot of Japanese and Chinese and Filipino and other Asian groups finding pockets of areas to live in, because that was a red line. Seattle was a red line city. Mm-hmm. By red line, just to be crystal clear, many groups, ethnic groups, and even Jewish people were redlined in many areas in Washington state. So it wasn't just known to Japanese, by the way, or African Americans. We were a red line city, and we need to be very clear that our history, our Seattle history, while rich and great in so many ways, also has a very ugly side to it. And I think it's important to realize that, not to dwell in the ugliness so much, but if we don't learn, we can repeat mistakes. And so in my neighborhood, yes, you had different socioeconomic groups. It seemed like the Japanese people knew each other. If I could digress to you, a funny story is that when my mother, who's no longer with us, when she had approached 80, I took her to, and she went to Bailey Gatchett. Again, she was born here. That's why she was the tragedy of being a citizen born here. interned, as the Japanese were. When she approached her 80s, I took her to a assisted living facility, and she was still in good health, but we thought it appropriate for her to be able to have her food cooked for her. And she saw so many of her friends that either she had been in internment with, or she had gone to grade school with. And it was so nice and joyful to see her with so many of her friends. And then they reminisced about Beacon Hill and the Central District. And it was nice to see a part of that. My mother was an amazing woman, and her strength, even in marrying an African-American man. Here's a picture, and I don't know if it'll show very well.
Oh, yes, I can see it. Oh,
my mother and father when they're about my age now, and they met at Garfield High School, and they graduated in 1951, and they were married in 1953, and they married their entire life. And one of those situations where one passed away and the other one passed away shortly thereafter. But I think they had the answers to what we're looking for in this country. And by that, I mean that both of their families, I don't want to sugarcoat it, both of their families raised eyebrows when they decided to marry one another. That came from the African-American side and the Japanese side. Basically, they were young. That was not good in their minds.
yeah.
And they were marrying outside of their race, which back in those days, in the 50s, there was a lot of ethnocentrism going on. But they had something deeper and better, which was true love and companionship. And they saw something in each other's hearts and minds and souls that said, we will defy all of that. And neither one were perfect, but they said, we'll stick it out together and love one another. It's a simple lesson, but still a great lesson. And so I see in the Central District, there were a lot of people when I grew up that understood neighbors speak to one another. Neighbors look for the good in one another. You didn't discriminate within your own community, and not just on racial lines. You were a community, you spoke to one another. And so I have very fond memories of the Central District.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for that. That's so powerful. Love and seeing what's in each other's hearts. That's the pathway forward. Sounds so relevant today, given the hate and violence that we're experiencing. Could you just pause, and you mentioned your mom as kind of this role model. Is there anyone else that you'd point to as an API role model who may have inspired you, whose accomplishments you'd like to shine a light on in honor of Asia Pacific Islander Heritage Month?
Well, I'll tell you sort of a funny story, and I hope it's funny at least, that because I started to compete in sports at a young age, 10, 11, 12, 13, I mean, really competitively. And, in our neighborhood, you got respect by a few things, but one of them were whether you could play ball or not. And it could be basketball, football, baseball, whatever the sport of the season was. But there were not a lot of Asian athletes to look up to. And I was named Bruce. And I used to tell people, well, it's because that guy, Bruce Lee, and I are so similar. So Bruce Lee, who actually, has roots here, and I've had the absolutely privilege to get to know his wife and his daughter Shannon over the years, and I did working on the Bruce Lee Museum. Bruce Lee was my idol, and so as a result, I watched everything he did, read everything I could about him. I took martial arts as a kid, and so people who are been around Seattle know as a linebacker, I never stayed still. I was always bouncing, and I would work out literally for hours and hours shadow boxing, because all I imagined was this beautiful man with a sculptured body, quick as a cat, and with cat-like reflexes. And Bruce Lee was my idol. And so I had posters all around him. So while he was not a personal mentor in that I never met him, I met people that took martial arts with him, he inspired me. And so I tell people that, yes, it's nice to have mentors. I had several mentors of different backgrounds. African-American mentors, white mentors, etc. This city raised me. But the imagery of Bruce Lee, what he represented, to me, inspired me, and so much so that, like I said, when I look back at the clips when I played football, I had a very unorthodox style because I was smaller than a lot of the linebackers. Although I hold records at the University of Washington, I was what would be considered a smaller linebacker. But I always thought about Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee was not a big man, but he was a ferocious man. So he was my idol and continues to be. I still, even in my age now, when I work out, and I still work out, I still play footage from him, and I still have posters of him. So I tell young folks, imagery is important. See something, imagine something that you're trying to be like, and align your actions with that. So I have to say Bruce Lee was my guy.
Oh, good. I'm a Bruce Lee fan, I must say. But it's so important, especially for kids today, knowing that they can be what they can see. And so role models like Bruce, role models like you, it says to our youth, they can be you. They can accomplish what you've accomplished. Go ahead, Bruce.
And I apologize. You said something that I got excited about to make a point that I didn't make, and that is, all the young adults to some extent, and that might be an overstatement, most young adults to some extent have mentors and role models. The challenge is some of them may not be good role models and good mentors, but children are often designed to emulate. And one of the platforms I've always run on when in office was the importance of mentoring and tutelage. That I take my parents, for example, who weren't able to attend college. However, I wanted to be an attorney, and they were neither attorneys, and we had no attorneys in my family. And I know you have an extremely impressive background, and perhaps you had college educated people around you or in your immediate family. My father's two brothers were actually college graduates and had graduate degrees as well from the University of Washington. My father just didn't take that route. But what my parents did do were they introduced me to different lawyers, and I had different people like Judge Leroy McCullough, who became a judge, who was my counselor at the Y day camp. I don't know if you know, Judge McCullough was a counselor at day camp. He was my counselor.
Wow.
But I was fortunate to have lawyers around me to say, you can do this. And so I had good role models around. And so what my job, or what our job has, I think part of our obligation is to make sure that we get positive role models from all around. I'm not a golfer. A lot of people golf. But if I had any inclination if my kids had any inclination to golf, I would find friends at golf to say, hey, hit a few balls with my daughter or my sons. That becomes critically important. Companies are realizing that to find the talent that they need, they have to invest in people when they are young, because often those that are doing extremely well, it's a result of them having people that have talent around them and can help them with a vision. So when they're already 10, 11, 12 years old, they form this vision. And again, if you don't have that vision, it's not a good path.
Yeah.
So anyway, I wanted to make that point.
Oh, thank you for that. It's really good. I wanted to just pivot a little bit. I wonder if you have any thoughts about the hate and violence that we're experiencing, both targeting the Asian community as well as the Black community. We know that those numbers of hate crimes in our city are soaring. What did you make of it? And how do you think we end this violence and heal the divide that's in our community?
Yeah, the anti-Asian violence now is alarming on so many levels. What's interesting is a conversation I had with a Chinese friend of mine who said that, and he was just being brutally honest, and that's why I won't reveal his name, but he said that he's been pretty fortunate in his life, that he grew up not being a minority in China, and that in America, he's done quite well. He and his family have done well, and he was well educated. He said he never really knew much about discrimination, never felt it. And he says in the last year, he said he realized what this thing called discrimination was all about. And I said to him, that's interesting. I said, I don't judge that. I do not judge that. I said, but if you look at history, again, going back to the Seattle riot of 1886, I said, just read that. That was a long time ago, yes, where you saw, again, rising anti-Chinese sentiment caused by, at that point, labor competition because of the gold rush that I talked about earlier. But you saw in Seattle an organization called the Local Knights of Labor. That's a scary name, the Local Knights of Labor, formed committees to basically forcibly remove Chinese, hundreds of Chinese from Seattle. And you saw violence as a result of that. Again, the violence that we see demonstrates the soft underbelly of this country that's there all along. I got to talk about Trump for a moment, that he's calling it the Chinese virus. And we're all now wearing masks. We're all afraid of this pandemic, that it was just enough to erupt this irrationality in our country that quite candidly was already there. It was already there. It wasn't created. It's been there in our history. That's why I go back to 1886. African Americans know it oh too well. Native Americans know it oh too well. Even in Seattle, we have to remember that in 2006 at the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle, 6 women were gunned down in an anti-Semitic act of hate. That was right here in Seattle. So that soft underbelly of hatred is always there that people could tap into. Leadership matters. And so what we're seeing again is the awakening of that bad part of our country. And so there are answers to addressing it. That's why leadership matters, that we have to now understand each other's cultures, understand each other. I go back to this picture I showed earlier. I go back to this, that they had to learn each other's cultures and customs. And, if you talk to someone of Ethiopian descent, they'll talk about the conflict in Tigray, that most people, including myself, are not as well versed in it as we could be, but that is near and dear to them, right? Because they're seeing a humanitarian crisis. And so I'm looking at the anti-Asian violence as now the opportunity for us to say, well, I guess, like my Chinese friend said, I guess some people may not have realized there's so much hatred going on, but there's hatred amongst ethnic groups. There's hatred in Seattle. There's hatred in this country. And our leaders have to be the strongest evangelists of love and compassion and commonality. They have to live it, breathe it, preach it. And that has to be the loudest voice in the room, not calling the coronavirus the Chinese virus. That cannot be the loudest voice in the room. We have to dominate that voice with voices of compassion and understanding. That's our opportunity in front of us.
Yes, when hate speaks, good men should speak louder and dominate the conversation. Yes. Bruce, this has been amazing. I know our time is winding down, and there's so many more questions that I could ask. But as we wind down, I wanted to give you an opportunity to share anything else that I haven't asked that we know people would want to hear from you if it's burning on your heart or in your mind. So any parting comment or thought before we close out?
Thank you for that, Lori. One parting comment would be that when we talk about anti-Asian violence, we have to also understand something critically important, that of course, Asia is a continent, and within the API community, there's so much diversity that, I have friends that will joke about not knowing the difference between an Asian or a Korean or a Japanese or a Filipino or a Laotian or a Vietnamese, and they all lump them together. Samoan, Hawaiian, Tonga. I mean, the Asian ethnic group, if you will, is vast and diverse. And I tell folks that now could be the time to try to really understand the difference. I have a first cousin who is Japanese who's married to a Chinese gentleman. He's my cousin too. And so I talked to their children about being half Japanese and half Chinese, and we had some good conversations there. That what I'm hoping that people realize is that even within the Asian demographic, there's so much rich diversity, and it's important to try to understand everyone, meet them where they are, not to highlight the differences, but again, to highlight what we have in common. When you are biracial like myself, I never make assumptions that a person looks like me or talks like me, they are either good or bad. I just want to understand them. I want to listen to them. And so I tell people that, I've had mean people and good people from every walk, old, young, every ethnic background, combinations thereof. And while it's corny, it is true that we really have to get to their character. And we have to recognize historical harm done on groups just because of the color of the skin.
Yeah.
So even though it doesn't affect you, recognize that it is real. And even if it may not affect you immediately, be sympathetic or empathetic to those who it does affect. And in this case, with anti-Asian violence, get to know them better and understand what we are going through right now. Even if you think you could trump it because you've had a traumatic experience, it's just not the trauma competition. This is the empathy competition. We're trying to be as empathetic toward others as possible. So I applaud the Y in celebrating API Heritage Month. It's a beautiful thing to celebrate something outside of your culture. And that is the lesson I think that's in front of us for all of us to learn.
Very good. Thank you for that. I'll hang on to that empathy competition. Thank you. Thank you so much, Bruce. We really appreciate your participation and your care for community.
Thank you, Laura.
So thanks everyone for joining us today for Community Conversations with the Y. Please join us again for another critical conversation to celebrate the rich fabric of our community, to learn together, and to advance equity and justice for all. Please be well and good to yourself.